Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, to our year in review 2021. This is probably the third or fourth year in review we've conducted. Pre-pandemic, it was face-to-face, but last couple of years, obviously, we've conducted this by way of webinar. My name's John McKenzie. I'm based in our New South Wales office. And I notice we've got participants all around Australia, so welcome. And we have a reasonably full agenda to cover today. So I want to take you through briefly COVID-19 developments and your responses, and that obviously is dictated by state requirements. The obvious return to workplace discussion as we free up in most states. Looking at the labour force, the workforce snapshot, where are we up to in terms of employment and so on, and following on from that, wage and CPI movements, as well as trends in enterprise bargaining. I want to take you through also Fair Work Commission developments as they apply to relevant matters to you as employers. And very importantly, this year, Fair Work Ombudsman updates and underpayment issues. So essentially issues around compliance. Also, whilst, if you haven't noticed, there's been some recent changes to the Fair Work Act, which I'll cover. And this discussion around the Great Resignation, which is currently overseas, but you may have seen being debated here as recently as last week on ABC's Q&A. And of course, finally, what your challenges are for 2022. So COVID-19 developments and your potential responses. So across the country, vaccination rates are increasing. That's leading to easing of restrictions within most states. At the same time, however, we have public health orders being implemented requiring compulsory vaccinations for employees. They differ by state and sector. The public health orders compliance provides grounds for employers to rely on the inherent requirements of the job when dealing with issues of vaccination hesitancy and resistance. There's various court challenges to the public health orders. Have been in New South Wales, most recently an ambulance driver, which was unsuccessful. In Queensland, police, which was unsuccessful, in Victoria across a couple of sectors, which is currently in progress. And importantly for employers, which makes it very complex, public health orders are changing regularly and regularly updating. So most recent example is compulsory vaccination requirements for Queensland health workers by the 15th of December. Now, those dates change. Obviously, there's compulsory vaccination requirements in WA. Who is actually covered by public health orders in terms of compulsory vaccination obviously differs by state and sector. Now, as we progress into the end of the year, the vaccine booster is now being encouraged. I heard an immunologist yesterday on radio say, you're not really fully vaccinated until you have your booster shot. So that will be a potential issue in 2022. And more importantly, as restrictions ease, employers can require employees to return to workplaces. Specifically, that's an issue in New South Wales where employers weren't required to require employees to come to the workplace. But as we reach here in New South Wales, 95% fully vaccinated adults, or by 15 December, employers can make that request. So what does all this mean for employers? Well, I think employers, if they haven't done so already, look to review and updating their COVID policies and procedures as these public health orders fall away. So those inherent requirements also fall away. And then you'll be looking to referring to your work health and safety obligations. So policy considerations in terms of your COVID-19 policies. So obvious question is, do you mandate vaccinations? Considerations there are, in addition, apart from public health orders, the assessment of risk, which is relevant to your business. The important thing is your work health and safety obligations to your employees, contractors, excuse me, and so on. Importantly, your business continuity requirements. I've advised a number of employers about business continuity requirements as an important factor. Then there's potential workers' compensation claims. In that case, the employee was not vaccinated, required to travel to the US for work, contracted COVID and died. His wife made a workers' compensation claim and the award is there, so a lump sum benefit of over $800,000 plus outstanding matters dealing with US medical and hospital treatment. And also, in addition to, for another consideration, is safety regulator interventions as they relate to whether, in fact, you're conducting a healthy and safe workplace. So, which is a couple of instances in Victoria. In addition to your policy considerations are privacy issues, so essentially compliance with the Privacy Act, and consider so whether, in fact, what you're requesting is to be compliant with your work health and safety legislation and becomes an employee record as such, or whether you can simply just request. So depending on what it is you're actually looking to implement. And then overall, what is the balance of risk? What does it favour? Does it favour you having a mandated vaccination policy or not? So we're actually advising a number of employers on that very question concerning work health and safety obligations and the balance of risk across a number of sectors. So recent cases worth covering in relation to this. So Curio and Cheltenham Manor. This was an employee that was instructed as part of the COVID-19 direction not to associate with employees on different shifts. The employee did so and was terminated, and the Commission found that direction was a lawful and reasonable direction in the circumstances. We have also Barbara and Good Start Early Learning. The Commission found that it was a reasonable requirement for a childcare provider to mandate the flu vaccination for employees that deal with children on a regular basis and are in close proximity to them. Then we have Glover and Auscare. This employee was a home care worker looking after elderly residents. The Commission found that mandating flu vaccinations in those circumstances was lawful and reasonable, and took into account Auscare's rights, in other words, its responsibilities to its aged clients, and the fact that a day overrode Ms. Glover's requirements to right to decline a vaccination and remain employed. And probably a very interesting case right now, which is on before the full bench right now, the CFMEU and Mount Arthur Coal. So the CFMEU sought interim orders in the Commission where employees refused to have a mandated vaccination and were not paid or stood down effectively. They sought that their payment continue. The Commission found that those interim orders were not required. Commission found that safety concerns favouring leaving the mandate in place until the full bench hears the matter today. So there's a number of other cases, but these are worth having a look at from your point of view in terms of lawful and reasonable directions, as well as compliance with work health and safety obligations. So a couple of questions, just to a quick survey. Wanted to just cover the question of mandatory vaccination and has Aurelia company introduced a mandatory vaccination policy? Yes or no? And then subsequent questions, if so, what is the date that the employees are required to be fully vaccinated? So I'll let you enter in your poll if you can click on your answer, and we will go through those answers and just have a look, make an assessment. Just give a bit more time to answer the question. Okay. Okay, so I think looks like we've finished. So 61% are not looking to introduce a mandatory COVID policy, which is interesting in the context. And of those that are, then you're looking at a later date. So the majority are looking at a later date based on employee consultation. So majority of those that are looking to implement a COVID policy are looking at doing it at a later date beyond January. So we will include these survey results in the presentation when we make it available to you following today's webinar. Okay, so we'll stop that sharing. Then we'll move on to the next slide. So the return to workplace discussion. Just on those questions. So bearing in mind what I've said about employers looking at their work health and safety obligations. So I think it is important as states open up, as borders open up, people start moving around, not only within the state, but within the country, international borders open up, that you at least review your COVID-19 policies and whether in fact you're going to require employees to be fully vaccinated. So the return to workplace discussion. There's this recent study from the Johns Hopkins and Badell at the Swinburne University. They've essentially noticed from their survey respondents 5 models of hybrid working. This is in this return to the workplace discussion. This first model is there's a fixed frequency in days. In other words, for example, fixed day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, as an example. The number of days, the second option, number of days are mandated, but it's up to the employees to select what day they work. Or more flexibly, the employees choose when and where they work, whether they work in the office, whether they work at home, or it's mixed, or employers are requiring full-time office or full-time home. So the survey respondents, of 78% of survey respondents, the respondents said that 78% of workers are now covered by working from home policy as opposed to 60%. So that obviously is increased. So essentially, it's recommended there that you look to review and revise your working from home policies. The Productivity Commission in its report also noted that there'll be probably a second wave of negotiations for work health and safety, which will probably take place outside the IR system. So employers will look to more flexibility in 2022. The ACTU also has a working from home charter, so that could be an issue in either enterprise bargaining or large workplaces outside bargaining. And then there's obviously in this process award compliance and consultation requirements. So that's another factor to take into consideration when you are looking to review your working from home policies. So another little survey here. So we're looking at a couple of probably 3 or 4 questions. What percentage of your workforce do you expect to be working from home in 2022? And there's percentages there. Of those working from home, how many days per week do you expect employees to be working from home? Number of days mandated, and the actual days mandated. So I'll let you answer those questions, take some time to look at those questions and answer them. We find this is useful for the purposes of our own research, but also I think that employers can actually make comparisons as they go through this webinar. So we'll just wait for you to put in your responses. So some people are still looking at their responses as we go through. While we're doing that, as a comparison last year, in terms of percentage of staff working from home, there was probably the smallest percentage was, the 32% and under 15%. And then the next one was 55 to 75% working from home. That was about a quarter of the workforce. So how does that compare to this year? So 75 to 100% working from home. That's obviously significantly different than the results from last year. In terms of number of days, so last year the number of days by the majority was 2 days. So it's that was 63% last year. So changed slightly down to 59%. So how many days a week working from home? 2 days is pretty much a large majority, and a small percentage there at 5 days, 4 and 5 days. Yep. So that's about the same as last year. So other number of days worked in the office mandated. So yes or no. So it's almost about the same. So in terms of what employers are requiring, do they mandate it, yes or no? Slightly more don't. In terms of who mandates the number of days, the largest response there is that the number of days are not mandated. They're negotiated between the employer and employee. In other words, so that's something which is worked out on the job. Then the second most common is the managers are mandating the number of days. Interesting, up to the employees, it's about 15%. And then we have a smaller proportion for teams that are mandating. So in terms of actual days, are the actual days mandated? About a quarter are, but interestingly, 75% aren't. So employers are from this survey are saying, well, we'll leave it up to the negotiation between the employers, the manager and the employees, and the actual days are essentially worked out, looks like, amongst discussion. So in terms of who mandates the actual days in the office, so again, so the majority there, 53%, are negotiated between the employer and the manager. The actual days aren't mandated, 20%, and then a smaller percentage of being mandated by managers at 21%. So that's a very good snapshot of what's happening in the workplace. So it looks like that there's certainly leaving it up to discussion between the majority of employers are leaving up to discussion between the manager and the employees in terms of days, number of days, and actual days working. So, all right, we'll just move on from that. Rebecca, thanks. Okay, so let's move on to the labour force. So around 13 million workers employed, slightly down from August, but certainly up from September last year. So no surprises there. What has happened is that full-time and more significantly part-time employees has dropped from mid-year, but the split is still roughly two-thirds, 1/3. Unemployment rate is down from September last year, so that's at historically low levels at 4.6%. The underemployment at 9.2 is also down from September. So underemployment is where our hours are reduced, or employees are looking for more work. And then unemployment is highest in South Australia and lowest in WA, 4.1%, very low there. So you can see the figures there for New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. So underemployment is highest in New South Wales and lowest in WA. And we have what's called an underutilisation rate, which is a combination of unemployment and underemployment, which is at almost 14%, which is also down. But it's probably where given the current state of the labour market, which we'll come to shortly, employers should be looking, in other words, looking at perhaps flexibility for with candidates in terms of hours and days work. That's perhaps where if you're really looking for some good candidates, it's probably where you may be looking. Participation rates are up again. So WA very high there, 68.8%. So obviously, that's an issue in WA, but you can see there the participation rates in the other states. And monthly hours worked have increased from 2.3% from September last year. In terms of workers that have changed jobs, these figures are up until February and were the lowest on record. However, obviously, I believe it's changed since then. But for the purposes of the statistics, the highest number of workers that have changed jobs were professionals, then followed by sales workers, and the lowest were machinery operators, followed by managers. So it's interesting there. So low turnover up until February, but I think what's happened is, of course, we've moved on since then. In terms of the percentage of workers in service, it's probably just under half of the workforce have worked for their employer for 5 years or more, and of those, about a quarter for more than 20 years. 1 to 5 years, 1 to 4 years service is just over a third, 36%, and then 18% have got less than 12 months service. And in terms of union membership, it's worth just noting 14% of the workforce are trade union members. The highest density is in education and training, public administration, then healthcare and social assistance. So no surprises there, really. The union membership is highest in the older age bracket, 60 to 64, which is almost double the workforce membership. And the highest union percentage in occupations is professionals, then community, personal care workers, and machinery operators and drivers, which will be most likely transport workers. Now, I'm probably telling you something you already know, but the job vacancies have certainly increased dramatically since this time last year. They've increased by, in the private sector, almost 2/3, 64% to 300,000. Obviously, they're impacted by international border closures, as well as student and visa workers not being in the numbers that they obviously were pre-pandemic. And of businesses that are reporting at least one vacancy, it's at around 20%. They're the highest survey results are in Queensland and lowest in the ACT. You can see the figures there for Victoria, New South Wales, and Western Australia. And the highest percentage of vacancies are in admin and support services. And then we go through to mining at 18%. So it's essentially the vacancies are across all sectors: construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, accommodation, food services, obviously hospitality as we open up. And the highest reasons for vacancies are dealing with a replacement or resignation. The second most highest is, interestingly, increased workload. So it says a lot about what's happening with the economy, that there's the second highest respondent rate is increased workload. And of course, looking at newspaper articles, and the anecdotal evidence is that there's increased labour demand, and current employees are seeking greater benefits, more flexibility, and which is creating wages pressure in itself. Labour shortages, as we know, are impacting production and service levels in many industries. So that's certainly the anecdotal evidence we're receiving. So sourcing labour overseas, the current complexities, there's international arrival caps. However, it was announced on the weekend that the federal government announced on the weekend that international borders will be open to students, temporary workers, and some tourists, all that are fully vaccinated, from the 1st of December. We probably won't see any impact of this until well into the new year, given that it's a recent announcement. And of course, there's travel bubbles, as you know now, between New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and Japan. So the borders are opening up, which goes back to my comment about everything freeing up and employers looking at their work health and safety obligations. There's a priority occupation list for travel into Australia for temporary residents. That's been expanded to now 44 occupations. However, there's a criteria which must be met. The closed state borders are creating issues for sourcing labour within Australia. We're hoping that will ease as borders open late this year and into the new year. There's temporary visa holders in Australia can leave, however, without an exemption. However, they must have one to return. So it's important that temporary visa holders in Australia make sure that they have an exemption to return. Then there'll be some changes to the agricultural visa arrangements, allowing overseas workers into Australia to help ease a growing shortage of farm workers, particularly at harvest time. Now, this slide was written before the federal government announcement on the weekend, so overseas students are likely to come back in greater numbers, probably still in the second semester, but perhaps a lot more in the first semester than perhaps originally thought. And then there's transitional arrangements for eligible visa holders, 457 visa holders. They must lodge a subclass 186 employer-nominated visa before 18th of March next year. So that's quite complex. I would suggest you take advice on that, and that your 457 visa holders check to see if they're impacted once these arrangements cease. So that's an important thing. You don't want to be left high and dry if you've got 457 visa holders. If you have questions, I would strongly urge you to contact our MAPI and Business Migration team. I'll have Sarah Pettit's slide up at the end of the presentation. So what's happening with wages, CPI, enterprise bargaining and so on? So wages and CPI, the average weekly ordinary time earnings, not a large increase up until May, 1.4%. So the males, you can see the average weekly ordinary time earnings is obviously lower in the private sector, and females is lower than obviously males. The highest average weekly ordinary time earning, no surprises, in the ACT, and then it's lowest in Queensland. Then in terms of actual industry sectors, it's highest in mining, and then lowest in accommodation and food services. And I think that accommodation and food services denotes the more casual nature of that sector, given that it's still opening up. Now, CPI, you would have heard about CPI pressures overseas, but CPI is currently 3%. That's from the September figures. We know that, and you would probably know from your own experience, there's global supply and cost constraints having a cost impact to your businesses. If you are sourcing any inputs from overseas, you know that there's delays, and you know that there's obviously increased costs. And currently, as we know, there's a worldwide demand for fuel, given what's happening in Europe in terms of the winter season. And also that's impacting Australia as well, and all you have to do is go and fill up your car. But there's also cost of new dwellings is having an impact as well, and that's partly to do with overseas supply for those new dwellings as well as just simple demand. So watch CPI. There's underlying labour pressures as well. So I think that that will be an issue for 2022 in terms of how you look at your wages policies, both CPI and also labour constraints. So what does it look like in enterprise bargaining? Well, the average annualised wage increase in June quarter was 2.4%. That's public and private sector, slightly down from the previous quarter. However, there's been no change in the private sector. It's at 2.6% in terms of average annualised wage increase. So Victoria and Queensland is the highest. Western Australia was obviously comparatively low at 1.5%. And for those agreements that were operative as at June this year, the enterprise bargaining increases contained in those agreements was at 2.6%. So there's really, in terms of private sector wage increases, the size of those increases similar to June 2020 and also March 2021 increases. So that's a factor to take into account if you're bargaining, but also what's happening in the labour sector generally. And number of employees covered by agreements is slightly down from the last quarter. No real surprises there, given that enterprise bargaining was probably impacted by COVID. So probably there's a number of expired agreements around. And in terms of percentage of workforce covered by the state and federal enterprise agreements, we're still relying on 2018 figures at just under 40%. So Fair Work Commission matters. It's always worth covering this so you know what is happening in the Fair Work Commission. The numbers of unfair dismissals is 20% down from the previous year. There was a spike in unfair dismissals and general protection matters during COVID. So the current level is probably at pre-pandemic levels in 2019. General protections were also down from the previous year, down by 15% and below 2018-19 levels. Anti-bullying applications were also down by 5%, but up slightly from 2018-2019. Those general protections and unfair dismissals, I think, reflect more stability in the workforce. In terms of applications to approve agreements, down 10%. Again, no surprises there really based on pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on bargaining. The numbers of applications to terminate after normal expiry date is down as well, so 16% down. Last year there was a number of applications to terminate during the pandemic, so there was a spike there. But I think employers are sitting on their hands right now for where agreements have expired and just looking to get to 2020. Then the applications to terminate during an enterprise agreement is slightly up, so that perhaps indicates individual pressures on the individual enterprises as to why they want to terminate their agreement. Interestingly, which was a factor a couple of years ago, where the commission, essentially the commission complexity was if you like, turning employers off enterprise bargaining. So the time taken to approve enterprise agreements has come down from 79 days in 2018-19 to 14 days in 2020-21, those without undertakings. And that reflects a level of streamlining of the Fair Work Commission process. So it's less complex now to have an agreement processed. The number of protected action ballot orders is down almost a third from 2020. No surprises there. Again, it does probably reflects the level of bargaining during the course of the pandemic. And I think that, as I said, employers are probably sitting on their hands and looking to what to do in 2022. And again, disputes about agreements. In other words, you've got agreements have dispute resolution processes. That is also down from 2020. And I think it also reflects employers and employees knuckling down and getting on with essentially running the business. And then there'll be, I think, perhaps this may come back up in 2022 as we get out of the pandemic. Other matters, increase in stand-down disputes by 35%. That reflects, obviously, the number of stand-downs that have occurred. So that's quite a large increase. And developments in right of entry permits, so that's up probably about 14%. That's, I think, an indication, when we're experiencing that as well, an indication of unions asserting rights to come into workplaces and talk to employees either for membership or perhaps look to enforce their rights concerning underpayment of wages, which leads us to compliance. So the Fair Work Ombudsman, I say this every year, are increasingly resourced. It is a fact. You really need to take note of this. And if you haven't done anything, then I think you need to look at part of this as an exercise in 2022. So their report, essentially in 2021, last year they recovered $148 million, which is five times greater than 2017-18 and a 20% increase. So there's almost 70,000 workers that are back paid, and then 76 litigations filed. So the Fair Work will do a number of things, and they will litigate as well. In almost $3 million in court-ordered penalties, over 2,000 compliance notice issues, which is essentially double the previous year. A number of unpaid wages recovered, doubled. And then infringement notices there. So on-the-spot fines of almost $500,000. So in addition to that, there's a Senate inquiry, as you know, if you recall, into unlawful underpayment of employees' remuneration, which commenced in 2020. It's been extended a number of times and now due to report on the 2nd of December. So I'd suggest you keep an eye on that. So what are the Fair Work Ombudsman priority issues for next year? They're looking at large corporate underpayments, fast food, cafes and restaurants, horticulture, franchise arrangements, and contracting arrangements. In terms of the corporate sector, there's a corporate sector branch which has been established. And as a result, there's increased corporate self-reporting, and mostly in large corporates, 17 enforceable undertakings, total of 19. That's up by half. And what was an enforceable undertaking? Well, that means that it's enforceable in court. It normally has a life. The employer is required to conduct independent regular audits at its own cost. Generally includes contrition payments and a public apology, and of course requirements to change payroll processes. So if you're actually in a situation where you've got to make an enforceable undertaking, then they're the sort of features. We've been assisting several employers in dealing with the Fair Work Ombudsman and their enforceable undertakings. So it's something we're familiar with, as well as general advice on audits and payroll processes. So in terms of that corporate sector, $82 million recovered. So there's a number of other features. So there's intelligence-led audits, essentially based on public knowledge, news stories, and also anonymous reporting. So as you can see down the bottom, there's close to 380,000 telephone inquiries from employees. So investigations just over 4,200. That's up 77%. And then $29 million recovered. So that's a five-fold increase. Of the audits, almost 700. Non-compliance is up. So we've spoken about non-compliance a number of times. The non-compliance is up. That's running at 81% of those 700 audits. The most common contraventions, the hourly rate underpayments, penalty rates on weekends, and which has just come up, annual leave. And I'm looking recently that there was a large corporate involved in issues with long service leave underpayments. So there's a whole range of compliance issues here that employees should be aware of and take into account. So in terms of what the Fair Work Commission essentially found, governance and internal controls to monitor, and so they're all defective. So some examples around outdated, ineffective manual processes. You've got to record hours of work and record time worked. Failing to comply with enterprise agreements. Applying annualised salaries that don't cover award rates for the hours worked. In other words, employers are working more than 38 hours a week and their remuneration doesn't actually meet the hours they work. There's poor payroll compliance. There's decentralised and ad hoc approaches to managing payroll and failing to invest in expertise to set up payroll systems, and lack of governance, lack of assurance. So all important factors that the Fair Work Commission noted. So I think that it'd be worth running your eye over that slide and looking at, does this actually apply to us and what do we need to do? So we have an IR and compliance team which can assist you with looking at those sort of features. So some recent changes to the Fair Work Act, most recently for essentially an expansion of the stop bullying orders under the Fair Work Act. So an employee that believes they're being sexually harassed at work can apply to the Fair Work Commission for an order to stop sexual harassment. That can be made from the 11th of November. So the Act's amendments define sexual harassment, clarify what sexual harassment at work is, and that what can be a valid reason for dismissal. And additional changes are that compassionate leave entitlements are now available under the NES for for miscarriage, and stillbirths. And so you might have read about the overseas factors in the Great Resignation. This is from a couple of US studies. So it was about 2.9% of the American workforce quit their jobs in August. That's attributable to what's called a pandemic epiphany or an experience effect. Pandemic epiphany is, do I really want to do what I'm doing? Am I happy with my job? And then the experience effect is essentially, I like working from home, I like the flexibility. So there's predictions that this could happen in Australia in 2022. There's an argument about this psychological contract, which is what I get in exchange for my labour and time and effort. So that argument, that psychological contract is actually changing between employers and employees is changing. So employee considerations that they're taking into account in terms of the surveys, looking for flexibility, perhaps career downsizing, looking for fewer hours, less responsibility, less stress, how they feel they're valued, and looking at how work is going to be reconfigured and how it's performed. So they mightn't necessarily like what they see. So they're all considerations for you as employers in reviewing your working from home, working from office requirements, and also obviously in 2022, and obviously look to consult with employees. If you have questions about that, it's worth contacting our leadership and culture team. I've got a slide there for Blake Redding as a contact at the end, so you can cover that. So what are your challenges for 2022? There's obviously, from your own businesses, we've got supply constraints that are impacting your input and availability and costs. That turns into obviously the CPI pressures, which are external and internal. There's obviously labour constraints given the current border closures as well as the demand for labour. So managing workforce expectations in terms of salary and working culture will be an issue. That in turn leads to how you define your operating model going forward. Obviously, a big feature is your COVID response and your compliance requirements. Managing employee welfare obviously was certainly a big issue during the pandemic and will continue to be. And then you've got compliance as well. So wages, awards, Fair Work Act compliance, and of course, your HR skills and all of those. And so your 2022, how will work be performed? As I said, there's labour, wages and cost pressures. You have attraction and retention issues. There's extra complexity for HR in managing a remote workforce. Review and update your working from home policies. At the same time, you've got Fair Work, almost been increased powers and greater proactivity. Then importantly, as a result, review your payroll practices and undertake audits for compliance. And then, of course, importantly, review your COVID policies and procedures in terms of mandating vaccinations. That's my business card. Well, as I said, we'll make this available to you as participants. There's a business card there for Blake in terms of the culture and leadership and culture experts, and of course Sarah Pettit, our talent and immigration expert as well. So thank you, and I'll hand over to questions. I'll just see in the chat. Whether we got questions. So whether there's anything there. So just let me know if there's any questions. No questions. So one question is, what are my future COVID-related responsibilities? So particularly given the state public health orders. So that's important question for employers outside the public health orders. The public health orders give you a degree of comfort in that you can require employees under the public health orders to be fully vaccinated or at least get their first jab, depending on their particular industry, and then second jab later. I think your first thing is look at your public health orders. If employees can't comply, then it's really about whether the employees are actually able to perform the inherent requirements of the job. And we're seeing that in some sectors. I'm seeing reports for example, in WA, where employees are in mandated sectors and they're refusing to get the jab. It's in health in various states as well. So there is the legal response, which is, well, you can't perform the inherent requirements of the job. Plus, there's a practical response, which means, how do I get these employees vaccinated? So I think that in a general sense, you would be looking at, in terms of the public health orders, education programs, and as well as encouragement, and then deal with those matters as much as you can on a case-by-case basis, and of course dealing then with the people that simply refuse, and that's probably a separate discussion. Then outside of the public health orders, then it's a question as to, and as they perhaps won't be a requirement going forward, particularly into 2022. What does it mean for me as an employer? As I said earlier, the states will be open up. People are moving around from within states, but also interstate, as well as overseas travellers. What is my risk? What is my balance of risk? What should I do? So it's a question there that employers should think seriously about their work health and safety obligations and undertake a risk assessment based on the nature of their operations. So we've advised a number of employers on risk assessments. A factor for you is that, putting aside the travel within states and within Australia and from overseas, you have a large proportion of children under 16 that aren't fully vaccinated, plus there's no vaccine yet for children 12 and under or 11 and under. So that's a factor. However, there might be some vaccine coming early in the new year, we've heard. But I think that's, as you look at your risk assessments, I think that will be a factor to consider. So we have a question here. What are the common increased new employee benefits being offered to attract and retain staff outside of remuneration increases? Well, that would depend on the sector. So, and of course, if you are essentially a manufacturing or other workforce that has to do with employees have to attend work, or whether you have the flexibility working in an office environment to work from home from time to time. So I think flexibility would be one across the board. So I think that you would be looking at ensuring that you take into account individuals with concerns about contracting COVID. What I mean by that is whether they have, in fact, a family member that actually contracted COVID, and assisting them in terms of their obligations to meet health orders and stay at home for a period of time. So there's those issues. And employers, I think, are also looking at, in a general sense, their wages survey information and salary issues in terms of whether they're in fact at market. So they're the main things. I think also in terms of its general culture, the relationship, as we know, with the immediate manager is always important. So it's, in terms of these flexibility, it's really, I think, from a culture perspective, ensuring that the managers and first level team leaders are actually aware in terms of how to manage and deal with all the individual needs. That's an important thing. So it's not so much a remuneration thing, it's also a workplace culture thing. And I think if you need advice on that, I'd strongly suggest you look at our workplace culture team. If the question here is, if anything I can do if an employer refuses to provide a copy of their medical exemption citing breach of privacy laws, that depends on whether it's a compliance with the public health order or not. So in terms of compliance with the public health order, most public health orders require employers to keep a record of the employee vaccination and also the employee exemption, medical exemption. Medical exemption is generally in a prescribed form from the Chief Health Officer in the relevant state. And there's, in that sense, there's no breach of privacy. It would be an employee record for compliance. In terms of other compliance, so where you have a work health and safety requirement that employees are vaccinated or must have proof of the fact that they can't get vaccinated from medical exemption, then that would be also something which the employer must provide, and that would form part of a medical record. Where you don't have a work health and safety requirement for employees to be vaccinated, then you look at whether it's a privacy issue or not. More than likely, in those cases where it's not a compliance with a work health and safety law in this case, then employees may argue quite rightly that I don't have to provide you with my vaccination status and I don't have to provide you with my medical exemption. So I think that what you'd want to do is take advice on that, because it's not straightforward. So do we have any other questions there? I hope that answers that question, Rebecca. No other questions? So in terms of privacy then, as while we're dealing with this, so where you actually have to, in a general sense, where you have to ensure that you've got to comply with a law such as a public health order or your work health and safety obligations under the relevant Work Health and Safety Act, then generally those requirements are what's called an employee record. So in the case of Kerry's question, where you are requiring employees to comply with a vaccine mandate from the work health and safety point of view, then an employee exemption would be a public health order. Would be a employee record. It's important that you look at obviously what's happening in all the states is obviously creating a lot of complexity for employers, because it's not, if you're a national employer, it's obviously not clear state by state, and it's changing. So it's important that you, as employers, keep up to date with the public health orders as they apply to employees in your sector, and also that you take advice as they relate to public health orders, as well as work health and safety obligations. And as I've said, we have from an organisation provided advice to employers in a range of sectors: tourism, culture and the arts, manufacturing, and transport, in terms of, also food processing, in terms of risk assessments and ensuring that in the context of looking for a compulsory mandate. And look, and the argument goes, in some states, WA and Queensland come to mind, it's not an issue here, so why do I have to get vaccinated? The answer is all you have to do is look overseas right now and look at Europe, and there's a third wave there in a number of countries. A lot of those countries, the vaccination rates are less than Australia across the board, but at some levels in some states. And we will open up our borders. We will open up our state borders. And as people move around, and as people move around to aren't vaccinated, particularly children under 16, then there's a likelihood that a highly transmissible version of the virus, such as Delta, will travel around the state. So, and the obviously principal reasons why we've had the lockdowns and these vaccine requirements is to ensure that our public health system can cope with the number of people that are coming to hospital and are in intensive care. And as we know, if you're fully vaccinated, then what it means is that the medical evidence at the moment is that you're less likely to go into intensive care in a hospital. You may get sick, be less likely to go into intensive care, into hospital. And so in terms of those other states where there's an argument that why should I get vaccinated, the answer is that, we're on the balance of risk. We're having a look at what's happening within Australia and around the world. We're making a decision based on our assessment of risk. One of the comments I put on the presentation last year was that the pandemic is not over, and it certainly isn't. We'll see an increase in infections overseas as we're looking right now. There is, importantly, you as part of your COVID-19 policy to ensure that you look at the booster shot, and I think that's an important consideration. And as we know, here in New South Wales, the vaccinations really took off from probably July, August, as the pandemic and the virus spread around, particularly Western Sydney. And those requirements for the booster shots will be probably coming up in February. In other states, perhaps not, but certainly I'm noticing that healthcare workers here in New South Wales and probably other states are looking to have their booster shot. So that's an important consideration for you as well. I don't know if there's any other questions. No, it doesn't look like there's any other questions. Okay. Well, look, what we'll do there is you've got 4 minutes of your life back. So once again, thank you for your attendance. What we'll do is we'll make this presentation available to you and if you've got any questions, included in the presentation are contacts from either myself in Sydney or Sarah Pettit or Blake Redding. As you can see, we've got a number of streams of service. So I think if you've got any of those sorts of questions about policies or culture or essentially immigration questions, then please contact those people in that presentation. Thanks once again. Thank you.